Greetings and welcome to In Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. World AIDS Day is annually observed on December 1 and provides an opportunity for a raft of exercises commemorating those who have died from AIDS-related causes, supporting those currently living with similar issues while fighting the disease and stigma around it. At home, CAISO, Sex and Gender Justice, in working with persons living with HIV, they have been working on a toolkit to provide more information specific to the LGBTQI+ community, focusing on HIV awareness and mental health. Now, to speak more to that toolkit, we have, as well as general work, we are joined by the author of the toolkit, population health graduate student Dominique Absalom, and program associate, Bachelor of Law graduate with training in diverse Caribbean sexualities, Kellog Nkemakolam. Mr. Nkemakolam, Ms. Absalom, thank you so much for making the time. I want to start off with you, please, Dominique, in terms of giving us an idea of what is the end result, what's the ultimate goal of this toolkit that you would have created?
The end result is just information dispersal, to be honest, because the toolkit is geared towards people in the LGBTQ plus community. But it's focusing mainly on people living with HIV, but it's not specifically for that audience. It's for anybody who works with that community, anybody who wants to learn more, anybody who just has an interest in just having that type of information, because it's a very holistic toolkit, to be honest.
Now, in terms of having a holistic toolkit, what are some of the, take me along steps in the journey towards making it? Was there a call for it? Did the CAISO see there's a gap? What are some of those steps? Why say, okay, well, this is something that we're going to devote time and effort towards?
Funny enough, I think separately we both realized there's a gap because I had just finished my master's in population health. I was interning with my school for a research project looking into HIV, STI services that you could find in the London area. And I realized, oh, there's not a lot of information about the population itself, the psychosocial aspect of it. There's not a lot of, hey, what are we thinking? What are they thinking? What do they want? So I reached out to CAISO because I knew of them. And I was like, hey, you can use my services in any way you want. And they was like, hey, we are thinking of this toolkit on HIV actually, and we came together.
I remember someone saying, talking about some of the differences between qualitative and quantitative students and being able to design what it is you want to suit the purpose that you want. So I really appreciate that answer. Mr. Nkemakolam, talk to me a little bit about CAISO's history and some of those things that we are looking at with regard to demands for World AIDS Day. Thank you.
So CAISO, as an LGBTQI+ organization in Trinidad and Tobago, we have done a lot of work with the people living with the HIV community. In terms of our history, we have one of our flagship campaigns is our Adult 3 campaign, which essentially seeks to have three additional protected categories added to the Equal Opportunities Act, which is meant to be an anti-discrimination legislation. And so we have been calling for the inclusion of age, sexual orientation, and health. And under health, HIV, one status as a person living with HIV, we are advocating for that to be added there, and this would prevent people from being discriminated against actually in the receipt of goods and services and in places of employment and those kinds of things. And we've also worked, and as part of this campaign, we've worked with a number of different organizations and HIV advocacy groups in Trinidad and Tobago, which includes the Patient Advocacy Mission, PAM, Family Planning, and Friends for Life. We've also, in our LGBTQI+ policy agenda, in that we published in 2020, we have been with, which is in collaboration with the Alliance for Justice and Diversity, we have included as one of the 13 action plans directed at the government, ministers, and policymakers to create meaningful changes in the lives of LGBTQI+ people. And one of them calls on the states to stop withholding critical medication for HIV prevention PrEP. So, yeah.
And in terms of that process, you just spoke about those 13 action points. Is it easier today in 2022 or than it was 3 years, 5 years ago? Is it a little harder? Is it a little more challenging? Because we've seen how the pandemic has changed some of the things that we do. But what are some of those factors that lead to the answer that you'll give me? Thank you.
So I can't necessarily comment on whether it's easier or more difficult, but I think as time goes by, it continues to be apparent that these action points and these calls that we're making are necessary, especially with the advent of the pandemic. So after the pandemic, we would have noticed how much people who have already been vulnerable, who are already part of vulnerable groups, and who have already historically and socioculturally marginalized, we see how they've been affected, especially in terms of access to resources, access to state services as well. And so this is one of the things that our Wholeness and Justice program seeks to address as well, because we just see it as, just necessary. And while we are calling for the government to make these changes and to, do their due diligence in taking care and protecting the rights of people in Trinidad and Tobago, the gap still needs to be filled. These people still have their everyday needs that need to be fulfilled, and CAISO endeavors with other LGBTQI+ organizations in Trinidad and Tobago to do as best as we could to assist in filling those gaps. One of it being HIV advocacy, and which is why we have this toolkit, or we saw that preparing this toolkit as necessary, because we want to make that kind of information related to HIV accessible to members of the community and widely discussed.
Thank you so much for that. And that kind of bleeds into the question that I have for Ms. Absalom, in the sense that it might be one thing, yes, you're doing your master's, and they say, wait, this instrument is a way to get to that master's. But outside of the academic side of things, what's the selling point? How do you say, okay, well, this toolkit is ideal for you? Take me through that a little bit. Let me get a little bit of your spiel, thanks.
I think the first thing I would say is that I said it's geared towards the LGBTQ plus community, but I feel like anybody can read it because it really is for anybody. There are tips, there are practices that you can use as an everyday person, but outside the community, I feel like our greatest facet of it is that it's very sex positive, and it's a very practical language. It's not very clinical. I feel like with communication, it's kind of a hit or miss, dependent on who you're communicating with and how you're communicating, which is how you often lose people. But I like to think that this is very open it's a very open discussion in this booklet. It's one you could take and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense to me.
All right, and we continue this conversation with Dominique Absalom as well as Kellog Nkemakolam. When we return, stay with us. We have so much more for you. Welcome back. We are having a conversation with the author of an HIV toolkit, as well population health graduate student Dominique Absalom, as well as program associate of CAISO Sex and Gender Justice Kellog Nkemakolam. And Mr. Nkemakolam, CAISO's history, her story, our story, doing this work. Why is it at this point in time that one of the things you're calling for is that making PrEP a little more available? And is there a backstory with it? Why isn't it available in the first place?
I don't think I'm the right person to answer why it's not available. But what I will say is why CAISO, because CAISO has been making calls for PrEP to be available and accessible to the public in Trinidad and Tobago. But the truth of the matter is we, as a country, we have an HIV response target to meet. That's the 95, 95, 95. And the PrEP in and of itself is one of the core components, or one of the core types of intervention, biomedical intervention in combating HIV. So PrEP is a drug or medication that can be used to prevent one who has been one from it can be used to prevent someone from being exposed to HIV. And well, last that we heard about PrEP from the Minister of Health, which I believe was in either 2017 or 2018, the minister himself, that's Minister Terence Dialsing, said that it's not the government. The government is not going to or is unwilling to make PrEP available. And he cited some of his reasons, according to a Newsday article, as it's encouraging, for lack of a better word, people to engage in risky behavior. But the truth of the matter is, PrEP is important, and it's necessary. PrEP saves life. There is science behind this. There are a number of studies that have been done, and it's also available and accessible in a number of countries throughout the Caribbean region. And so why we're making this call, particularly today, it being World AIDS Day, also to interrogate the government's position in that regard. We think it's important for this discussion to be had. We think it's important that it's in the public consciousness, so that we know what's going on, and we're able to clarify, what the rationale is for not making PrEP available and accessible, and also checking in as well with the government, because Minister Terence Dialsing would have made that statement a couple of years ago. It's 2022 now, so we're also trying to check in with the government to find out if this position remains the same, and if so, why.
And holding individuals accountable, finding out what is happening and doing so in a transparent manner. And one of the things you just said raised the point that I want to toss to Ms. Absalom, in the sense that everybody knows. But sometimes when everybody knows, but you're not able to put it down black and white to say, okay, well, this is a position paper, this is a formal submission, things are allowed to exist as they are. Doing this toolkit, Ms. Absalom, are there any more gaps that you see existing that you would want to address? Because sometimes you're doing something, especially for that piece of paper, you need to operate within confines and parameters. So what is next? What is the gap that you want to look at next and deal with?
That's a very easy and hard question, just because I feel like pertaining to this community in particular, I'm going to talk about, because there's so many different gaps pertaining to sexual health and gender justice. I feel like there's so many gaps that you could fill in. Well, I like to take a qualitative look at things. Quantitative is great. The governments move on numbers, and I feel like that's important. But I like to understand how people are thinking. I feel like some gaps are. One interesting sector is the health sector. How that community is integrated in that sector, how the response of it. I feel like that's something I've been interested in, and something I would love to know more about, just because in making this toolkit, we have to reach out to many different clinics, many different health centers, many different treatment sites. And I feel like the responses are varied. The responses are across the board. I would like to understand how the interworkings of like policy, how that is integrated in terms of LGBTQ policy. But that's a talk for another day, to be honest.
But is there a way or a manner to kind of triangulate? Yes, you say government would move on numbers, but even if we're looking at the fact that, yes, these are the numbers, but these individuals may require a little more attention or access because they have a greater circle of influence. So how do we treat with that? Is there a way that we get both numbers and that qualitative aspect?
So at first I was going to pipe pessimistically, because in my time in academia, being there, you understand how things work. You understand how sometimes numbers are the most important in terms of schools themselves, universities, and governments and policy. But I feel like one of the new facets of academics is a combination of quantitative and qualitative. It's a little bit heftier. I did it for my thesis, but I feel like it gets a very holistic view of what you're trying to say. Okay, these are the people, but this is what they're thinking. And I feel like that's a good way to integrate a lot of future research because numbers are great. In numbers in mass, you can see, okay, this is a large population of people, but it's kind of voiceless and it doesn't lend humanity to that community. So in terms of the LGBTQ community, say, okay, this is a facet of them and they require this particular thing, but you don't really see the cultural, societal, psychological impact of it if you don't talk to them.
And we have about 2 minutes more on Mr. Nkemakolam. CAISO World AIDS Day Campaign 2022, Wholeness and Justice Services. What is that about? What are some of those things that you're saying, okay, well, these are the things that we're really focusing on at this point in time to carry forward in the work that the body is doing?
Essentially, like I would have mentioned earlier, there are a number of gaps that exist, particularly for LGBTQI plus people and other marginalized groups in Trinidad and Tobago. So CAISO, for 2 years now, actually, we have had the Wholeness and Justice Program, which seeks to respond to experiences of human rights violations by LGBTQI plus people in Trinidad and Tobago. And in doing that, sort of expand their access to redress and enable healing, resilience, and self-advocacy. So we do this by making or providing legal support to these persons, and this is in relation to the experiences of violation, and also providing clinical support through psychosocial intervention, as well as all the other types of counseling and therapy to these persons as well who have experienced violation. And we also have a wholeness development component, which seeks to sort of address whatever other gaps that may exist that contribute to or that is affected by that person's experience of violation. And this is because essentially we understand and see people, as whole people. And so when a person experiences a violation, it's not just that they experience a violation, like we don't want to like narrow that person to just that one experience of that violation, but also trying to address other issues that may have been exacerbated by that experience or that was caused by that experience to ensure that there's a sort of like holistic intervention and development of that person.
And in 30 seconds each, I'll start with you, please, Kellogg. Why is HIV everyone's business?
HIV is everyone's business because we're all affected by HIV either directly or indirectly, and I think it's important that everyone, especially in relation to the call that CAISO is making today, that everyone is able to access the kinds of medication and intervention that's important for them to be able to deal with and combat the virus. As a society, as a government, we've signed on to various international agreements that commit to this cause, and we think it's important that the government sort of abides and fulfills that commitment that they've made in the international space to their citizens.
Thank you so much, Ms. Absalom. Why is HIV everybody's business?
I feel like it's everybody's business just because the conversation, it's a very open discussion once you're ready to have it. I feel like once you look at it in society, it lacks a lot of humanistic qualities. I feel like these are people. When you talk about HIV in Trinidad and Tobago or across the Caribbean, it feels lacking in like humanity because you talk about HIV like it's an othering, like it's these people don't exist once they have it. I feel like it's really important because they're people just like us, and they are treated as if they don't exist. Their standing in society doesn't exist. So I feel like that's why it matters.
And I think it's really important, that thing you just said, if you are willing to have that conversation. So we thank you, Dominique Absalom, as well as Kellog Nkemakolam, for having that conversation with us. And on behalf of the entire TGT News team, we thank you for tuning in. This has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.